All right, so we've got this essay, Ban that do. So we're diving into individual liberty, huh? Where does society's control actually stop? That's always a fun one.
Yeah, and this essay, it jumps right into this concept of, get this, the tyranny of the majority.
Tyranny of the majority, okay, that's different.
Right, like we always think of democracy as this good thing, which, it is. But the essay, it argues that even a majority vote, it can be wrong, especially if it's like totally steamrolling individual
There's
rights.
not enough to just follow the rules because most people like those rules. Interesting.
Exactly. And it gets even, well, a little darker, I guess. The essay, it compares this whole societal tyranny thing to like political tyranny.
Oh, wow. Okay, so how's that work?
Well, it's saying that societal pressure, it can be even sneakier than like a dictator. It gets into your everyday life. It's like it's trying to control what you think, what you believe, all without like actual punishments or anything.
It's that pressure to fit in, right? Even if you're not sure you agree with everything.
Exactly. And that's where the essay draws a line. It's saying the only reason to restrict individual liberty, the only reason should be self-protection. If what you're doing isn't hurting anyone else, society, they need to back off. Even if they think you're being, a little out there.
Okay, sure, but who decides what harm even means? Seems kind of subjective.
Right. And the essay, it gets into that using this really interesting example from history. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, considered a pretty wise guy.
Yeah, vaguely. Didn't he persecute Christians or something?
Exactly. And that's the point the essay's making. Even Aurelius, as smart as he was, he saw Christianity as dangerous, thought he was protecting Rome by, trying to wipe it out.
So even with the best intentions, you can really mess things up.
Yeah,
Makes you think about what truth even is, if you're not allowed to question anything.
exactly. And that leads to a big point the essay makes, this idea of free speech, open debate. It's vital. It argues that if you silence people, even if they're dead wrong, you block the path to truth. It's through that clash of ideas, that's how we figure things out, right?
Makes sense. You need that back and forth to really test your ideas.
Yeah.
But the essay doesn't just stop there, right? It connects this free speech idea to something bigger, something about individuality.
You got it. It's saying this pressure to conform, even in your own personal choices, it's stifling. Limits what people can do, makes them less likely to try new things, and ultimately holds society back from finding better ways to live.
So we're all kind of shoved into the same box, even though we're all different. I remember the essay uses a great analogy for
Oh
this.
yeah, the clothes and shoes analogy. It says, look, you wouldn't force everyone to wear the same size outfit, right? So why expect a one-size-fits-all approach to work for how people live their lives? Individuality needs some space to, breathe.
Totally. And trying to make everyone the same, that just sounds boring, frankly, not to mention probably impossible. But the essay goes even further, right? It says individuality, it's not just about expressing yourself. It's essential for actual progress.
Exactly. It's a bold statement.
Mm.
The eccentric ones, the ones who don't quite fit the mold, they're often the ones pushing us forward, challenging the status quo, bringing new ideas, even when it makes people uncomfortable.
So we need people who are willing to shake things up a bit, even if they seem a little strange, right?
Mm.
But the essay, it also brings up something kind of worrying.
Yeah, and it's a big one. It's like we're seeing less and less individuality these days. It's almost like people are afraid to stand out, to be different, and it's a problem. A society that discourages individuality, it risks becoming, well, stagnant, like cutting off the source of all the new ideas and innovation.
Okay, so we've established individual liberty, it's important, essential even, for people to grow, for society to grow. But where does government fit into all of this? What's the essay's take?
It argues for a limited government, especially when it comes to personal stuff. It says, yeah, the government's supposed to protect its people, but not at the expense of individual freedom, especially when it comes to choices that mostly affect the individual.
Okay, so a light touch, but
Mhm.
where do you actually draw that line? I think
Mm,
the essay gave some specific examples here, right? Something about education and like regulating stuff.
Yeah, you're right. Those are perfect examples of where things get tricky. Let's take education, for example. The essay says education, super important, should be mandatory, but the government, they shouldn't be calling all the shots on what or how we learn.
So everyone needs an education, but not a government-dictated education.
Right. It's like the government, they should focus on making sure everyone has access, but they got to allow for different approaches, different viewpoints within that system.
Interesting. So it's about providing that foundation, but then letting individuals explore, interpret things on their own. What about the other example? The regulating stuff. That seems like a big one for individual liberty.
It is. And the example the essay uses, seems simple at first, regulating poison.
Poison. Okay.
Right. It argues that, yeah, you need safeguards, obviously, but those safeguards, they can't be so strict that they prevent people from using it legitimately.
Yeah, you don't want to make it impossible to buy cleaning products just because they could be dangerous if misused.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, protecting individual freedom, but also, keeping people safe.
This reminds me of that tyranny of the majority idea from before. Finding that balance between what individuals want and what's good for everyone, it's always a balancing act, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you know what? The essay argues that one of the biggest threats to this whole balance, it's not just the government, it's something way more widespread.
You're talking about that whole tyranny of custom thing,
Yeah.
right? Like, we do things a certain way just because, well, that's how they've always been done.
Yeah, exactly. The essay, it argues that blindly following tradition, it can be just as bad as any government rule. It's like we don't even stop to think if there's a better way of doing things. We're just stuck.
Which brings us back to those people who do think differently, right? The ones who challenge the norm. The essay seems to think they're pretty important.
Huge. They're the ones poking holes in those outdated traditions, experimenting with new ways of doing things, even if it makes some people uncomfortable, right? The essay celebrates that. They're like, the key to moving things forward.
Yeah, they shake things up, make everyone else rethink things they just took for granted.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're constantly told how you're supposed to act, it makes sense that that kind of creativity gets stifled, right?
Absolutely. A society that values fitting in over being an individual, it's going to stagnate. It's like, imagine a muscle, right? If you never use it, it gets weak.
Okay, but there have to be some boundaries, right? You can't just have everyone run around doing whatever they want with zero consequences.
Yeah.
So where does the essay draw that line?
Yeah, it's crucial. And the essay is super clear. Your freedom to do whatever, it stops when it starts hurting someone else. That's where society steps in.
Okay, sure, makes sense on paper. But in real life, that line isn't always so clear, right? What about situations where it's not like direct harm, but more about risk, or maybe just people having different values?
You're getting at the core of the whole thing, and the essay, it goes right for it. It uses the example of regulating like dangerous substances. We touched on this earlier.
Right, like that poison example.
Yeah.
There's a clear danger there, but also you need some balance, right?
Exactly. It argues for a careful approach, something that discourages people from misusing stuff but doesn't totally restrict things for people who need it.
So like clear warning labels, maybe make it harder for certain people to get a hold of dangerous stuff, but not like a total ban that punishes everyone.
Right. It's all about protecting freedom as much as possible, but also being smart about safety. And this idea, it comes up again when the essay talks about education, right?
Right, we talked about how it's for compulsory education, but the government shouldn't be dictating what kids are learning. So how does that actually work? I mean, you need some kind of standard.
The essay throws out this fascinating solution, standardized testing, but it focuses on like really concrete knowledge, the stuff everyone agrees on. But when it comes to, the more subjective stuff, the controversial topics, that's left open to interpretation.
So teach kids the facts, but let them form their own opinions about what those facts mean. I like it, but I can see it being a tough sell for some people. What about the argument that people need to be protected from making bad choices, even if it means, holding them back a little? Isn't there a responsibility to look out for each other, even when we screw up?
The essay addresses that head on. It's a huge point of debate, right? And it acknowledges the good intentions, but ultimately it pushes back.
So it's that whole you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink thing.
Yeah.
You can't force someone to make what you think is the right choice.
Exactly. The essay says it's about individual responsibility. You have the right to mess up, even if it means dealing with some not-so-fun consequences.
So instead of trying to create this perfect world where no one ever falls, maybe it's about teaching people how to pick themselves back up, right? How to learn from their mistakes.
That's the heart of it. The essay says a society that tries to shield everyone from every little danger, it ends up treating people like children. It takes away their chance to develop their own critical thinking, their own resilience. And those are important for a good life.
So making bad choices, those moments we screw up, they're not just inevitable, they actually matter. They teach us stuff.
Exactly. It's those experiences, the good and the bad, that shape us, help us figure out who we are, how the world works.
You can read about something in a book, but it's not the same as living it, right?
Yeah.
And that includes making those mistakes, learning those tough lessons.
Exactly. It brings us back to that idea of a marketplace of ideas we were talking about before.
Oh, right. Truth comes from letting all those ideas bump up against each other, even the ideas that make us squirm a little. It's hard, though, isn't it, to really listen to viewpoints you disagree with, especially when they challenge your own beliefs.
You're right, it takes guts to really engage with ideas that make you question things. But the essay, it argues that's how we grow intellectually, right? It's about being honest with yourself.
So it's not enough to just tolerate different opinions. You have to actively seek them out, engage with them, even if it makes you uncomfortable.
Exactly. It argues that shutting down dissent, even if you have good intentions, it just makes it harder to really understand anything.
It's like if everyone around you always agrees with you, how do you even know if what you believe is right? How do you test it?
That's the point. The essay says you get closer to the truth by really testing ideas, having open and honest conversations, even when they're tough.
It's about being humble, admitting that you don't have all the answers, right? And being open to the idea that you can always learn something new, even from someone you disagree with.
Precisely. And the essay argues that this isn't just some abstract idea, it has real consequences.
Okay, so how does this individual liberty thing, this embracing of different viewpoints, how does it actually work in the real world? Because the essay seems to say that just having laws protecting freedom, it's not enough.
You're right. It goes deeper than that. True freedom. It needs more than just words on paper.
So we're talking about like a change in mindset, a cultural shift, not just laws.
Yes. The essay says we need to build a culture that actually values these things. Individuality, critical thinking, actually talking to each other about tough topics.
Which sounds great, but really hard, right? Especially when everywhere you look, it's all about fitting in, following the rules. So where do you even start?
The essay says education is key. It's about building a system that gives people the skills to think for themselves, the knowledge to understand these complex issues.
So less about memorizing facts, more about how to think critically, how to analyze information, formulate your own opinions.
Exactly. We're talking about raising a generation of active learners, people who aren't afraid to ask questions, who can look at all this information we're bombarded with and figure out what makes sense.
It's about more than just having rights. It's about actually using them, making them a part of how we live.
Exactly. And the essay argues that this isn't just some pipe dream. It's crucial if we want a society that's truly free and, actually good.
It's a really inspiring vision, but realistically, there are always going to be people who try to take those freedoms away, whether it's in the name of security or, some idea of what's best for everyone.
True. And that's why the essay says we got to be vigilant.
Vigilant against what?
Against anyone who tries to grab too much power. The government, big corporations, doesn't matter. It stresses the need for checks and balances, making sure power isn't all in one place. And that takes a strong, active citizenry, people who are paying attention and holding those in power accountable.
It's that reminder that freedom isn't a spectator sport, right? You got to be active, got to fight for it.
And that fight, it's not just about words, it's about what we do. It's about building a world that's more just, more equitable, more free. And that takes work.
It's a big task, but if it means a better future for everyone, I'd say it's worth it. This whole conversation has really got me thinking. This balance between individual freedom and what society needs, it's messy, right? Always changing. But this essay gives us some good tools to start tackling these questions, to start building that world where freedom can actually thrive.
I agree. It's a great reminder that this conversation about freedom, it's never really over. It's an ongoing thing, constantly questioning, debating, pushing for a society that values every single person.
Well said. This has been amazing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and remember that journey towards freedom, it's a journey worth taking. So not too hands-on, but not totally hands-off either, like finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. The essay, it says the government's job is to create a system where everyone has a chance to succeed, no matter who they are, what they believe, and of course, protecting those basic freedoms, speech, assembly, the big ones.
So making sure everyone can live by their own values, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. Sounds good, but the essay seems to say the government have to be really careful here.
Absolutely. It warns against trying to define the good life for everyone.
Right, because who gets to decide that anyway? It's different for everyone, isn't it?
Exactly. A truly free society, it lets people make their own choices, even if those choices lead to different outcomes.
So less about forcing some specific way of life on people, more about giving them the tools and the freedom to figure it out for themselves.
Exactly. And that takes trust. Trust that people can generally make good decisions for themselves, and trust that a free society, it can course correct when things go wrong.
I like the idea, but it's tough, isn't it? People like certainty. They want to be told what to do. The essay seems to get that. It's saying this whole embracing individual liberty thing, it's not just about laws, it's a whole way of thinking.
You got it. It's about certain qualities. Being humble enough to admit you don't know everything, being open to different points of view, and valuing honest conversation, even when it's difficult.
So basically, accepting that we all make mistakes, being willing to listen to people who disagree with us, and realizing that we might actually learn something from those disagreements.
Exactly, and having the guts to stand up for what you believe in, right? While respecting other people's right to do the same thing, even when it challenges your own beliefs.
Man, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But it feels important,
Mm,
especially these days when it's like everyone's telling you what to think, how to feel. It's exhausting.
you're right. It's more important than ever. This world, it's getting more polarized every day, misinformation everywhere, democratic values under attack. This idea, this essay, it's more relevant now than ever.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that freedom, it's not a given. It's something you constantly have to work at. Question things, challenge the status quo, and actually talk to each other. Respectfully, but honestly.
And it's not selfish fighting for freedom. It's about creating a world where everyone has a chance to live a good life, a life that means something, and to do it on their own terms.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, really got me thinking. This whole balance between individual liberty and, what's good for society, it's complicated. But this essay, it gives us a framework, a way to start thinking about these things, working towards that world where everyone is free.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, this conversation about freedom, it never really ends. It's something we have to keep coming back to, keep questioning, keep discussing, if we want to build a society that truly values everyone.
Kind of said it better myself. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. To everyone listening, stay curious. Keep those minds open. And remember, that journey towards freedom, it's a journey worth taking.